whisper it quietly. But I think we might be in for a few days of summer-like weather. Well, at least until the weekend when I'm planning a barbecue. The outlook then is for that most typical of British barbecues, the one where your husband is sent out to cook in the garden with an umbrella. Keeping with that theme today, we're off again to the Emerald Isle, this time to visit Diarmuid Fitzgerald, who'll read to us from his books Thames Way and A Thousand Sparks. And of course, we'll have a wee bit of a chat along the way. I do hope you enjoy it. It's been making me smile all week as I've been editing. Well, hello, my name is Patricia and this is the Poetry Pcast. You're all welcome here. Now, as I wrote these words about the Emerald Isle, I wondered why it was given that name. And I thought I'd better check. Well, as you might have gleaned from my intro, I think it's because it rains profusely, and that's based on personal experience, which makes the landscape rather lush and green. 40 shades of green, according to the Johnny Cash song. Here's a snippet of the lyrics. I wish that I could spend an hour at Dublin's churching surf. I'd love to watch the farmers drain the bogs and spade the turf. To see again the thatching of the straw the women glean, I'd walk from Cork to Larne to see the 40 shades of green. I'll put a link to the show notes to the YouTube video so you can hear him singing it. And you know, I can remember my family singing this at one of the many parties of my youth. The Irish diaspora in London was and for all I know now, is probably huge, and my family seemed to be a huge part of the South London posse. I have to admit, when I saw this video, it brought a tear to my eye. Anyway, amongst my research, I also found a poem by William Drennan. He was alive from 1754 to 1820 and was something of a nationalist hero. He wrote a poem called When Erin First Rose. I'll give you the opening lines, and of course, the link will be in the show notes if you want to read the full poem. When Erin first rose from the dark swelling flood, God blessed the green island and saw it was good. The emerald of Europe, it sparkled and shone in the ring of the world, the most precious stone. So I think he's just confirming my opinion that the Emerald Isle is known because of its abundance of water, which causes the green. Anyway, just a quick reminder, if you're coming to this as it's published, that's early July 2024, you should be writing Seru for the reading period this month. Deadline the 15th. So you need to get a wiggle on. And if you're on the mailing list, you should already know the exciting news I've been banging on about for a while. If you're on the list and you haven't seen it, I sent the mail about the 2nd of July, so do check it. And if necessary, of course, spam. But if you're not yet on the mailing list, there'll be another mailing on the 9th. Something fabulous is taking place, and only poets on the mailing will be invited to take part. Don't say I didn't warn you. So with that, let's head over to Dublin and have a chat with Diarmuid and hear some of his haiku. Diarmuid, thank you very much for joining me today. Let's hear a little bit about you. We're, of course, going to be able to hear once you start talking that you're not British like myself, nor will you be American. So tell us a little bit about where you grew up, where you were born, where you grew up, and where I believe you continue to live.
Yeah, well, I was born in Ireland, born in the late 70s, and I grew up in Ireland. So I was born in the west coast of Ireland, in a county called Mayo. My parents come from Kerry, which is also on the west coast of Ireland, but a different part. So I've no actual connections with Mayo, but I just happened to be born there. My parents were living there at the time, and then they moved down to the south of Ireland, to Cork. So I grew up in rural Ireland and County Cork, the south, and I was there till I was 18, and then I moved to Dublin, and then left Dublin, and I lived in Japan for 3 years. So that was an experience. So I lived mostly in Osaka, and then towards the end in Kyoto or in Tokyo, I mean. And then I was lived in London for 2 years uh, after that. And then after that, I came back to Dublin. And then I was down in West Cork for a little bit, back to Dublin. And since then, I've been in Dublin. So I consider Dublin home now because I have some family here and mostly friends and connections. And that's where I am.
Surely good. You've preempted some of my questions, but we will come back to your shall we call it a wandering lifestyle up until till now, where you
Mm.
sort of decided to put yourself in Dublin. You mentioned you spent 3 years in Japan.
Mhm.
Is that where you learnt about haiku and learnt how to write them?
No, I had been writing haiku before I went to Japan, but I always think when I got into haiku, it psychologically prepared me for the move because I was getting to know the Japanese culture at a distance and in translation, it has to be said, rather than direct experience. And so I was writing poetry since I was 17, and I had a little bit of, publication experience in college, won prizes, all that kind of stuff, some early success, which was nice. And then that all stopped when I left college. And I noticed that my poetry was getting shorter and shorter to the point that it was kind of becoming like 3 lines and 4 lines. And I thought, okay, well, maybe I'll try this haiku thing because my understanding of haiku then was what you learn in school, the 5-7-5 form, any kind of poem, any kind of line, as long as it fits in, that's you done. So my first attempts at haiku were like that. So there were the what I it would be like beginner haiku, and then I then picked up a book called The Haiku Anthology, the third edition by Cor van de Heuvel,
Mhm.
and I read that, and I realized fairly quick, oh, most contemporary writers in haiku don't even follow the 5-7-5. So that was one of the first things I ditched was this adherence to the 5-7-5. But most of my haiku then was still what you might call Gendai haiku or kind of intellectual,
Mhm.
they were kind of very conceptual based, and they were kind of mostly around ideas. And occasionally I would write what you would now call a more traditional, more regular haiku. So they were somewhat nature based. And I did that for about a year. And then I moved to Japan and all that. And then it took me a while to find a haiku writing group in English. I did they're based in Kyoto. So a guy called Stephen Henry Guild, who you may have heard of. Um, he's involved in a very much in haiku through the Ritsumeikan University and a group called Hailstone Haiku Group, which actually I'm technically still a member of. And I went along to that, and they kind of really emphasize the Zen spiritual tradition
Oh,
behind haiku. And I started to kind of get into that more, and I started to read the Four Masters. Now, again, this was in translation in English, and kind of really getting the depth, the spiritual depth behind it. I think the fact that I actually lived in Japan made it easier because, say, for example, if I went to a Buddhist temple, I got that direct experience of what the haiku masters were talking about. So if they were like, but talking about incense or hitting the gong or doing all that, like that was there. That wasn't just some sort of imaginary thing, that was real. Um, so that really helped then. And I noticed then my haiku got a lot more depth to it. And kind of I got into that. And I sort of wrote more haiku from that place on. And then I kind of continued that. I came back to, well, London initially, and then Ireland. When I was in London, I didn't do much writing because I was just too busy. And then in Ireland, reached out again and met people in a group called Haiku Ireland,
mhm.
and then through a Haibun writing group. And I've kept up that connection since then. So people you may have heard of, people like Maeve Sullivan, Sean O'Connor, Roberta Beery, people like that. So I've linked in with them and others like Jim Norton and others and so on. So that there's a very active, though small, haiku writing group in Dublin and in Ireland, and they produce quite good work for
Mhm.
such a small community.
Well, isn't that true of the Irish anyway? They're a
Mm,
terribly literary bunch for such a
yes.
small community.
Well, when you're up against the likes of Yeats, it's kind of like on Heaney, you're like, okay, well, you got to produce the work. Like, I think
Yeah.
it's a bit like the Japanese people, who write haiku. Okay, you're up against the four masters. Good luck.
Yeah, that's very true, actually.
Yeah.
You didn't tell us what took you to Japan. Why did you head off in that direction then, if it wasn't for the
Why I went to
haiku?
Japan, I wanted to go somewhere different. So I was 25. I was working the bank. I hated the job, absolutely
Oh,
miserable job. Didn't want to be there. But I was in that situation of I want to leave, but I don't know what I want to go to.
hmm
And a lot of my friends were leaving, they're going abroad, and they were doing the usual thing of go to America, go to Australia. And I'm like, okay, Ireland's different to those countries, but because we speak the English language, there's still too much in common, and I wanted to
yeah.
go somewhere different. So I was looking at Africa or Latin America, but then I thought that's a bit too different for my liking. So then the idea was, well, why don't I go to Asia or East Asia, like Japan or China or Korea, or where it's like that's different without, you still get the lifestyle, the Western lifestyle without the Western experience. And it's kind of like, okay. So I was always drawn to Japan because at this stage I was writing haiku
hmm
and Japanese culture. So um, eventually I applied there. I tried to get on the JET program. That didn't work out. I was supposed to go to Korea, but my
hmm
heart was really set on Japan. So I ended up going to Japan instead.
hmm
And I ended up in Osaka City. I was placed there by a company, an English language company.
Ah,
And that kind of just got me set up and get going. And it was kind of like an adventure. I was 25 that age, and I was kind of like, if I don't go now, I'll probably never go. And I'm glad I went when I did because, it was that right age of enough maturity to know I wanted, but not tied down anywhere where you can kind of, you're a free bird.
hmm
And I did. So, and initially I went with the plan just to go for 1 year, for one.
So you were teaching then, teaching English. Okay. And
Yeah, doing TOEFL teaching.
okay. And what I mean, did you learn the language while you were out there in any shape or form?
I did. I did. When I went over, like I had the word Japanese. Like, all I could say was konnichiwa, and that was about the size of it. And initially, the first year, I didn't really learn anything, or first 6 months, because I was kind of just finding my feet. And then,
Mhm.
second of all, I suppose what happens to expats, you can kind of get into the bubbly world of where all your friends are expats, and they all come from more or less the same culture. I won't say country because there's people from America, Canada, Australia, but we're all English language speaking, so we all get each other.
Yeah.
And I was getting that little bubbly world. And I realized I had to kind of, I wouldn't say step out of it, but make some efforts not to be in there all the time.
Yeah.
So I started to learn Japanese and I started to pick it up and read it and do classes. And things went on from there. And towards the end, and especially when I moved to Tokyo, most of my friends at that point were Japanese people, not Westerners. And then I was really beginning to pick up the language, so I could understand some of it. I could
hmm
have basic conversations. I could book a hotel room. I could go to a restaurant and read a menu, get pick out certain
Oh,
words.
okay.
I got to a stage of where it was just I could function just about. If there's any complications, I'd have to default to English. But just very, and I could ask a question, but of course, inevitably, I didn't understand the answer because
Yeah,
I'd
that's
ask a question, and I'm like, well, okay, I understood 2 words out of the 20 you just said or thereabouts. So I think that's the way lang. I think if I was to move to Switzerland and I had to learn German from scratch, I think it would be a similar experience,
mm,
you know, and
yeah.
that kind of a thing. Though I think it'd be easier in German because it's I, you read it as you pronounce that kind of language.
Yeah, pretty much. And
Mm.
it's written in the same script as you learn
Yeah,
your normal language as well, which I think
yeah.
is
Mm.
the thing with the Chinese or any Chinese dialect and the Japanese, well, East Asians, I suppose.
Mm.
That that slightly worries me when I head out that direction. Sort of loss of control and not knowing what you could what the signs are saying and so on and so
Yeah.
forth. Although I've not been to Japan in fairness, so I don't know.
Yeah, well, they
Maybe
have all
we
the signs in what they call it. You could say English or Romaji. It's written
okay.
in the Latin script, so at least
Yeah,
that way. They
yeah.
have the basic signs in English as well. Exit, entrance to kind of tell you that. So
Okay.
it's helpful from that point of view. That helped me as well. And well, Japanese language is actually fairly easy to speak. It's not complicated.
hmm
There's about 104 sounds, and it's
hmm
just a combination of all of those.
Yeah.
And it's just learning to put those in the right order. And the grammar is very straightforward. Like it's not complicated grammar. It's not like French, where the verb to and the polite form, and it's not like
Oh,
Chinese where you have to intone it different ways. If you don't tone it the right way, you're either saying the wrong word or a nonsense word. So there's none of that. Um, just the writing is the most complicated bit. It's head wrecking. Um, but the speaking and the listening is reasonable.
No, you said something interesting there. The sort of intonation. Um,
Mm,
is it very flat in terms of
yes.
tone?
So, for example, if you think of place names, like they would say Osaka,
Hmm.
Tokyo.
Hmm.
We might say, for example, karate, but that's not the correct way. It's karate. We might
Hmm.
say Toyota as the car, but it's Toyota. So if I want to say my name is Diarmuid, I could say Watashi wa Diarmuid desu. So like
Hmm.
Watashi wa Diarmuid desu. Watashi wa Arendujin desu. I'm an Irish person. So it's
Hmm.
very da 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 da.
Okay.
And that's where the 575 comes from, because in Japanese language, almost all the syllables or onji are the same length. The language are like jigsaw pieces that are all the same size, so therefore you can pretty much put any word in.
I think we cover that a lot on the podcast in terms of how that doesn't translate that easily to our own to whatever
No.
other Western language you learn. But what I've started to become very interested in is how we translate, or do we not bother to translate the rhythmic effect that a Japanese haiku would have versus something that we would write. I don't know if you've ever thought about the rhythm side of things.
Not as much, but it's something I definitely am paying more attention to now.
Hmm.
Um, I think, yeah, if you can approximate the rhythms, that would be as important, especially if you're doing translations.
Mm. Oh yeah, for
Um,
translation, definitely.
yeah, and then I think like the cutting words, the kireji and all that kind of stuff would be important because it's an important thing in the haiku.
Mm.
So I know we use punctuation for that, like dashes and M dashes and all that.
Yeah.
Um, so I suppose in English we just have to try and approximate things rather than copy.
Mm.
Um, but there's a limit to even that because you're kind of reaching outside of your own language to take something that's not there.
Yeah.
So the question of how far do you go? So it's very easy for the Japanese because their language is a very onomatopoeic language.
Hmm.
You know, like when they're describing things, like there's a particular sound, say if rain is falling on a metal roof and it has that sound, they will actually have a specific word for that. You know, whereas the English
Okay.
language we don't. Even the
Oh
word
no.
hanami, like it's
Hmm.
one word, but it means cherry blossom season. But like we don't have, you know, words like that for English, like, you know, Virgo watching season or moon watching season. You know, Japanese will have one word for that to nail that,
Yeah.
whereas we don't. Um, so that's where there's limits to how far you go.
That's right.
And I think the main thing with the English haiku isn't to try and imitate the Japanese haiku. It kind of has to follow its own path and do its kind of grow in its own way. And I think it's doing that anyway.
I think
Um,
you're right that the next question would be, and we aren't here to talk about that now, but it'd be interesting just maybe to ask you because of the differences, because I think you're right, the English language haiku has got to follow its own path.
hmm.
How far are we diverting from what haiku in Japan would be because of those differences?
From my understanding, there's a huge multiplicity of approaches in haiku in
Mm.
Japan,
Okay.
as much as there is in the English language. So you'd have the very, very traditional people
Hmm.
who will write very traditional and cleave that, and that tends to be the majority.
Hmm.
I think, from my understanding of it, those who write in Japanese haiku. Then there's the Gendai haiku, who would be more contemporary. They deliberately break the rules. It's more intellectual and all the rest of it. And then there might be some that might be a little bit of both, sort of halfway between the two.
Hmm.
Uh, my take on it is the English language just follows the same thing. You get people who are very traditional approach, not many. You get those who are very out there and they produce very experimental stuff to the point where I don't consider those poems to be haiku because they're just three lines who may have to be 575 and they have elements of a haiku in it, but they're not really haiku.
Hmm.
And then I would think the mainstream in English is somewhere in between.
Yeah.
My way of taking it is if you're following the spirituality or the Zen spiritual traditions, things like, you know, Wabi Sabi,
Hmm.
Kereji, Akarumi, all that kind of stuff. If you're doing that, then you're more likely in the mainstream. And
So,
whether you adhere to the form or not isn't that important to me. Like syllabic count isn't that important.
oh
You know,
no.
if it's a one line, a two line, a three line, or a four line. I'm not fixated on that. I'm like, you know, what's the sense? What's the feeling behind this? and you can kind of get that from when you're reading a poem, you know. So
Hmm.
that's where I think the majority of people in English language tend to go for that sort of middle of the road approach, and I personally agree with that.
Oh, you give me a bit to think about there. But anyway, you didn't come here to debate me on
No.
or talk about that. You came to read from two of your books.
Hmm.
And the first one is called Thames Way,
Hmm.
and it's fairly self-explanatory. You were taking a journey along the Thames, and you've preempted the question. Was my question was going to be, why did you take to walking along the Thames rather than go along the Shannon or the Liffey? But I guess it's because you were actually in the country.
Well, initially, when the idea came to me, I was when I actually did
Okay.
the journey. I wasn't living in the UK anymore at that point, but I had done a little pre-trial run.
Okay.
Well, reason why I walked the River Thames is simply because of practicality.
Hmm.
As you alluded to there in the UK, one of the good things I like about the UK is that walkers have the right of way,
Yeah.
whereas you don't in Ireland. So if you
Oh.
decide to walk across the farmer's field, as long as you're sticking to the signposted path or the established way, you have the right to walk that way.
Hmm.
The farmer can't come out and say, get off my land. Unfortunately, that doesn't exist in Ireland. If you walk across a farmer's land, he can get his gun and chase you down, and you're trespassing. So, and in Ireland, the farmers are very, very protective. It's a colonial psychological thing. It's the whole history there. So there are very few rights of ways in Ireland. And there are very few laid out paths compared to the UK. So I thought, well, if I want to, like, I can't actually walk the River Shannon, because I'd have to
Hmm.
cross over Farmers Field and have to
Hmm.
ask every single farmer for permission. I could
Okay.
forget about
Yeah.
that. So at least the Thames Way, it's an established path. So that was one reason. Secondly of all, I kind of was drawn. I'm drawn to nature, and I find when I
Hmm.
go on these long walks, um, I find that's conducive. It gets me into what I call the haiku space.
Okay.
So I get into that kind of space where I mightn't necessarily write haiku, but I'm in the receptive mode of it.
Yeah.
And I kind of wanted to test myself and see, could I walk the entire river and
Hmm.
then write something, anything?
Hmm.
I basically set myself a very low bar as well. I write one haiku, one tanka. If I do that, success. And I actually
Hmm.
ended up writing 200 of them. So they came pouring out,
That's good.
which was a pleasant surprise. And then that eventually a lot of editing became the book Thames Way.
Absolutely. There was one question I had to ask you about, and maybe I've misunderstood the book, but you didn't quite walk all of the Thames. You
Mm,
did from Tower Bridge
yes,
to Gloucestershire,
yes,
basically. Am I right? So you missed out
correct.
on what is possibly one of my favorite stretches, but again, maybe that isn't a totally walkable from Tower Bridge to the sea. I've done bits
Well,
of
it
that
was
because of where I come from, but
mm,
I don't know if there's a
mm.
path from on that part.
The path itself actually stops at the Thames Barrier officially, and
Oh,
it doesn't go
okay.
beyond that. And
Okay.
then it was partly out of time constraint because it was going to take me about a week and a half to 2 weeks to do the entire river.
Okay.
And I just had to lop off a bit. And also I had read in the guidebooks that the bit from below Tower Bridge isn't that interesting, or so I was told.
Oh,
Now, whether that's correct or not, I don't know. I just took that advice on board and just went with it. So I didn't do that stretch there. So I started off from Tower Bridge and went up, which I actually realized afterwards was unusual because most people start off in Campbell, the source, and they come down.
yeah. Yeah, I imagine that's definitely the case. I'm heartbroken that you've heard that stretch, that final stretch, isn't that interesting. Shall we hear some of the poems from
Yes.
Thames Way?
Yeah, so Thames Way is actually mostly a tanka collection with some haiku. And if readers don't know what tanka is, basically, it's kind of like a haiku, it's a bit longer. I won't get into technicalities of tanka versus haiku because we could be here all day.
No, well, we're going
So,
to do a bit of that later in the year anyway, so no
mhm,
worries. But I think most of our readers will or listeners will have some clue, some inkling as to what the
mhm,
tanker is.
yeah. Okay, so this is from Thames Way, and then this is from the lower section. Fountain water sprays up and down, with children laughing. One mother reaches for a quick kiss. Fountain water sprays up and down, with children laughing. One mother reaches for a quick kiss. White lily, trumpet in the wind, searching for treasure, a bee snuggles down. White lily, trumpet in the wind, searching for treasure, a bee snuggles down. Foam and scum whirl in the canal, dancing atoms, galaxies circle in space. Foam and scum whirl in the canal, dancing atoms, galaxies circle in space. Water over the wide weir, echoing long after I have moved on. Water over the wide weir, echoing long after I have moved on. These next few haiku are from middle. In the marshes, without my map, joyously lost. In the marshes, without my map, joyously lost. A brown fly drowns in lemonade. I sit drinking beer. A brown fly drowns in lemonade. I sit drinking beer.
Now, Dermot, as I said before you started reading, this was your first book of haiku. What did you learn
Mhm.
about haiku and how you write from just doing this?
Well, first of all, I learned to get into the receptive mode because I think when you write haiku, it's quite different to other forms of writing, but even in poetry, haiku requires you to be in a state of presence, you know, to be receptive. Otherwise, you end up writing kind of what I would call head haiku or genda haiku, which is very intellectual. So if you want to write good haiku, it's like you have to be really present and observant
Mm-hmm.
and not caught up in your own emotions with what's going on. More like this is what's happening around me and everything. You're curious about everything. So it's almost like a childlike sense of being. I think that's what be what like Issa would kind of if you read his haiku, you get into that mode. So that was confirmed to me when I wrote The Thames Way, and then afterwards when I finished it, well, when I had written it and had this basically 200 haiku, I knew not all of them were going to make it. So there was kind of three groupings. There was the haiku that were done that were actually pretty good that
Mm-hmm.
didn't need to be left alone. There were the duds. There were just hopeless cases, just push them aside, never mind. But it was the bit in the middle that had potential, but they weren't working. And they're the tougher ones. So that's why I joined an organization called Haiku Ireland. I joined them. And then they were giving me feedback on haiku. And then I met a lady called Maeve Sullivan, and I asked her to mentor me in haiku and tanka, and she did. And so she basically went through the entire first manuscript and gave me feedback on them, and there was a back and forth, and eventually I learned how to really bring the haiku and scrub it up. As I was walking the River Thames beforehand or during or afterwards, I was very much reading Shiki, the master
Ah.
Shiki-san, uh, and he had an approach which is called, I don't know what's in Japanese, but it's called sketch from life. So it's very observational based haiku. Not strong at the time, that very strongly influenced me. So when I was walking the River Thames and doing all that, I was very much in observer mode. So I was
Mm-hmm.
just kind of like observing things, writing things down, and noticing things, and not really adding too much to it, other than, doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's okay at the beginning, but sometimes to give a haiku resonance, you need to go beyond just a bit more observing. It's kind of like, how do you connect with the emotions in a non-emotional way? So it's that tricky balance of, you're implying an emotion without stating it. And I did find that quite tricky and hard to do. I think in some of the haiku on the tank I've done that, but other ones I don't. So it just depends there. So I learned a lot, as to what the standard should be
Yeah.
for haiku and tanka. And it was, I'm getting the mentorship experience was really an educational experience.
And I guess you learned how to kill your darlings as well.
Yes, you learn not to be precious. Not so much in this book, but more so in the second book. That's where I really learned that yeah, because I think this book, like when I presented it to Kim Richardson, who's my editor of Alba, he accepted apparently on the basis that he called it a cohesive collection. It was all
Mm-hmm.
in one theme, and it all kind of came for that.
Yeah.
And I only at stage had some haiku and tanka published, not many. Still sort of learning, but it was a
Mhm.
different story for the second book.
Well, I'm glad you brought the second book up because it's time to have a reading from that.
Reflecting, the sun shattered into 1,000 sparks. Reflecting, the sun shattered into 1,000 sparks. Buying beer from the vending machine, a gift of warm coins. Buying beer from the vending machine, a gift of warm coins. Spring cleaning, old love poems, this empty box. Spring cleaning, old love poems, this empty box. Water, over the brook, I keep coming back here. Water, over the brook, I keep coming back here. Months since anyone has visited, I ring my own doorbell. Months since anyone has visited, I ring my own doorbell.
I wanted to ask you about that one because
Mm,
reading through it,
mm,
um, I got the impression, particularly from the intro, that you went back and had a look at previous work and
mm.
and that was the way you formulated this particular collection. Is that how
Yeah,
you did it?
yeah. So I
Okay.
suppose Thousand Sparks, which is the second book, it's a bit like
Mm,
the second album. It's when the band brings out an album and it suddenly takes off and they're famous, and then the recording companies, come on, bring the second one out, and they're like, oh god. So it's like you go through your back catalog and then you bring it all out, and you're like,
hmm
again, it's the same thing. Some great songs, some okay songs, and some, oh my god, what was I thinking when I wrote that song? So I basically went through my entire back catalog and I put it all together. It was 400 haiku. And like that, at least half of them were just pure duds. It was just like straight off the bat, just
Okay.
don't even bother. And then it was that thing of, yeah, some of them are working, they got published in journals, and then there was the in the middle ones. So I worked on them based on my experience, and I kind of tried to bring them up a little bit. And there was more Senryo in the 1,000 Sparks. It's kind of, I think my strength is more Senryo than haiku, to be honest.
Okay.
And so they brought more of that in. And then also with some of the haiku, they're more shape based. So that's kind of like wavy ones and ones with asterisks. And
hmm
I was kind of pushing the boat out a little bit in terms of the actual form and
hmm
kind of, putting ones that are a little bit more edgy and a little bit more sensual and about relationships and that. So that's what made it different. Thames Way was all about the River Thames and very much nature, haiku, and tanka, and very
hmm
observational. I was trying to step away from that, and this one I kind of bring the emotions to the fore. And then what helped me with that was I gave the manuscript in progress to two people, Sean O'Connor, who is the
hmm
now was the editor of the Highburn Journal.
That's
He went
right.
through it and he gave me his feedback. So I had to learn to scuttle up. And then I gave it to Roberta Beery and asked her
hmm
to go through it. And she said, I don't hold back. And I said, oh, no, don't hold back. Be as hard as you want. Well, she nearly like incinerated the entire manuscript. And I came back, with my tail between my legs going,
Oh.
okay, when you said don't pull back, I did kind of didn't want to go that far. So it was a chastening experience when you get somebody of that level of experience going through your work and kind of saying shit, 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 improve, improve, improve. But then the good thing about her, she actually showed me how to do it.
Oh,
It
okay.
wasn't just lecture, lecture, lecture. This is not
hmm
working. She actually rewrote some of my haiku with my permission
hmm
and showed me this works better. And I was like, oh yeah, it does. So I really pushed the boat out there, and then I set myself a target, but also my publisher set me a target of had turned down an earlier version of the manuscript because I sent him the manuscript and he said, no, this is not a themed collection for it to be a
hmm
proper haiku collection. All of the haiku have to be published. I went, that's going to take like decades. So I set out every week I would churn out haiku and send them out to different journals.
Oh.
Really, I would just with military operation. And within 2 years, they were pretty much all published
Oh, good. Okay.
all over the place. I signed up to every single haiku journal I knew, and I pretty much took them all. And then there was a few small residue of. It's funny because some of the ones I liked the best weren't picked up by anybody, and I just put them on my
Oh.
web page and they're published. So I got around like that. And I came back to Kim and going, they're all published. No, you can't say no. And it's been through the ringer. So of two very high quality haiku writers. So I'm like, I'm done
Hmm.
with getting feedback here. I just want
Hmm.
the thing out.
Um, it's interesting what you said, and bless bless you for going through that process. That must have
Mm,
hurt, going
it
through
did.
the ringer, as you say. But you said that this one was slightly different, but I found you were still writing about place, or places were inspiring you to
Mm.
write. I don't know if that's what I was meant to be getting out of the book
Well,
itself.
yeah. So one of the things I did was thinking, oh, how do I organize this? So Thames
Hmm.
Way was easy. It was literally follow the
Yeah.
course of the river. It kind of it organized itself. Where the Thousand Sparks is more diffuse. So again, haiku is primarily nature-based poetry.
Hmm.
So I like and nature is about place. And I said, so I structured it in three parts, Ireland, Japan, and Ireland again. And I kind of went, so although there's a lot of scenario in it, I decided to, still honor the place because I think scenario, while it's about people, it can be about people and place at the same time.
Hmm.
So and I see a huge overlap between haiku and scenario. Some people don't, but I do. And that's how I organized it. So I was thinking, well, that the haiku I wrote, which were the very early efforts, and these are some of the more salvageable poems, and I did a lot of scrubbing up. Then there was the Japan section. That's where we got into the Zen tradition of haiku, and that's
Hmm.
where, and there's a lot more about people in that one. And then the Ireland again is a bit more 50-50 of place and people. Um, so I did that. And then the book ends on a haiku sequence where again like Thames Way, except it was a smaller one. I went up and down a train line journey, and I wrote on that day a whole load of haiku
Hmm.
there. So again, that place does come into it there.
That last one, Dermot, could have been written during COVID, but it wasn't. Can you tell us a bit about it, please?
Yeah, I suppose I was going through a bit of a transition in my life.
Hmm.
I noticed that I had a lot of friends, and then they kind of all fell away. Not all of them, some of them, and then I was kind of making new friends.
Hmm.
So I was living in Dublin at the time, and I was in this kind of in between place of, say, when I moved back from London, I had a lot of friends there, and I didn't really have, and I was down at the west coast of Ireland and back again. I didn't really have a lot of friends, and I hadn't kind of reached out in groups, so I was kind of feeling in a little bit alone and sort of in between
Hmm.
places. So I wrote the haiku based on that, and I was trying to how do I capture that sense of being alone,
Mm.
know, without kind of getting too heavy about it, kind of like in a jokey way. So I remember coming home or to the house I was living at the time and noticing the doorbell and like realizing nobody's rang this doorbell, in months. So I actually rang it myself and kind of was laughing to myself. I'm like, this is a little bit silly, isn't it? And this is a bit desperate. So I kind of wrote a haiku about it, and that eventually took a while to get it in the right form, but that's what came out. But yeah, I think
Mm.
during COVID, that kind of really gave an extra layer of resonance because of the whole people not meeting people,
Yeah.
weren't allowed to meet.
Hmm. Yes, I believe it was quite stringent in Ireland, from what I've heard.
Much more so than the UK. Yeah,
Mm.
definitely. It was like you were the first wave, you weren't allowed to meet anybody. You weren't allowed, it was very, very stringent. So I think if you were family and you had good relations with people, you were living in a house with people and you got on okay with them, that was fine. But if you didn't have anybody, you were really stuck.
Yeah, horrible days. Don't want to
Mm,
go back to that one at all. I've got another question.
mm.
You've not chosen any from the Dublin Bay section of the book, but if I may, I'm going to ask you to close out the podcast today with a poem that speaks to me of an image I would have seen time and time again, as I
Mm.
would have been waiting for the ferry home to England.
Beyond the thick walls, the waves, again, again. Beyond the thick walls, the waves, again, again.
Dermot, thank you so much for coming along and reading to us today. Before we say our final goodbyes, you should really tell us, where do we buy the books?
You have to get in touch with Alba or myself directly because they're actually not online. So if you go into Alba Publishing is the name of the publishing company.
Hmm.
You can send them an email, and then basically Kim gets in touch with me. Or probably best is get in touch with me directly because I have the books here. He doesn't. He
Okay.
doesn't scan them. And then you can purchase them from me. So I have a email address, deanireland@gmail.com. So it's DEENIRELAND@gmail.com. Or you can look up my website, dwriter.com, and you can send a message through that. But the email is the direct approach there. And I have copies for people if they want to buy them. So it's the copies say it's €12, but because of postage and packaging, that will have to be extra, I'm afraid. Um, and I might have to up my prices because of cost of living.
Oh
So
yeah. Oh yeah.
so you're
We're all
looking
very familiar with
€15,
that.
maybe possibly up to 20. I'd say, well, definitely I'd have to find out wherever you are in the world if
Mhm.
I'd have to add on the post and packaging as
Absolutely.
top.
I'll put the links in the show notes so people can get in touch with you, and then you
Yes,
can take it from there when you find out where they are. So thank you very much, Dermot, for the reading
you're
today.
welcome.
It's been a total pleasure having you, and I hope you come back and do some more reading. When I hope,
Yes.
have you got more books planned?
I'm actually do have a book of regular poetry published that came
Hmm.
out a few years ago, also by Alba,
Hmm.
and I'm writing a non-fiction book at the moment on creative writing and healing,
Oh.
and I'm hoping that that might get published by Hay House, the spiritual group of people, who knows. And I've written a novel which is midway through its development, so I kind of left the world of poetry to a certain extent and gone into the world of prose
Hmm.
and doing that. I am still writing poetry and I'm still working away, but it's regular long form poetry. I've kind of not really doing haikus much. I do write occasional haibans,
Hmm.
send them out, and they do get picked up, but
There you
it's
go.
it's not a thing that's top priority for me right now.
Oh, so we'll have to wait and see what comes out first now then.
Mm,
Fiction or non-fiction. So good luck with them. And thank you
thank you.
so much for joining us today. Well, I hope that made you smile as much as it did me. Thanks again to Dermot. Remember, his contacts are in the show notes, so do go and check them out. And I forgot to mention in the chat that he's written an essay for our Highborn journal, Tendrils. I'm working at getting that to print at the moment. If you're on the mailing or have contributed, hopefully you have done both. I'll let you know all about its publication in a mail. It's going to be available in print and PDF format. I hope you can support the podcast and buy a copy when it's out. And if you've enjoyed this podcast, perhaps you can buy us a coffee or take out a membership, which has benefits for you too. I'd really appreciate it. It's time to work on the website, and from the quotes I'm getting, it's not going to be that cheap to accomplish what I want to get done. So anything you can donate will be definitely appreciated. Do tell your friends about us. Maybe give us a shout out on your social media. There's just not enough hours in a day for me to do full justice to socials and researching the content for the podcast. So any help you can give me is more than appreciated. Thank you so much. So now I'm off to spend an hour in the garden. It's time to sort out my little ponds. I do hope I don't disturb the newts. I was going to bring you a haiku about newts, but couldn't find any. Does anyone know any? Let me know. Send me an email. So I'll see you soon. Until next week, keep writing. And don't forget to check out the info in the show notes. If anything's missing or you need to know more, just let me know. Ciao.
Beyond the thick walls, the waves, again, again. Beyond the thick walls, the waves, again, again.